While during the lecture and also during the discussions, would like to ask you to mute yourself. We've got currently 30 participants, so if there's some unmuted, it can get quite noisy, and we will invite you to unmute yourself once we get started with the conversation. I think some of you have already started to put things in the chat. I would like to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat, and also during the lecture, and then especially also during the conversation after, would invite you to share comments and questions in the chat that we can then pick up in the conversation after the lecture, where we will have, first of all, a chance for comments, for questions and answers with Peter, but where we then also want to see your views about what we might learn about the practice as community researchers. So looking forward to that conversation. Sorry about my rambling. What I will now do very briefly is to just say a word or two about ARVAC. So ARVAC, the Association for Research in the Voluntary and Community Sector, was founded in 1978, so we've been around for a little while, and it was to provide a focal point for what was quite a small group of people engaged in research with voluntary organizations. And we have continued to do this. And why do we organize lectures like this? Is so that we stay in contact, because we think it's important to maintain that bridge between communities and those who work within, those who work in communities and the researchers. We've got a few core beliefs, which I want to briefly quote because they are important to us. We believe that healthy, diverse, and inclusive communities make a fundamental contribution to people's quality of life and living conditions. Also, that healthy communities are created and sustained by the activities of effective local organizations and groups. We think that research has a major role to play in promoting and supporting and developing the work of such organizations and groups. And crucially, we think that participation in the research process and access to all its products should be freely and widely available. And now I can turn to introducing the speaker who will give our lecture this year. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Peter Beresford to you. Peter is an outstanding academic, an engaging author with an authentic and compelling voice, and a campaigner making sure that people with lived experience of using health and social care services and other services provided by the public and voluntary sectors are listened to, so that we can build better and more inclusive services and support. I first came across Peter's work 20 years ago, and I first met him in 2006 at an event I organized about collaborative practice in research. I've admired what he does and how he does it ever since. This might also explain that this is not the first time that Peter speaks at an ARVAC event. I remember well, for example, when we got together in 2010 with Carl Milowski from the States and Peter Halfpenny and Cathy Farrow in London for a symposium about making voices count in an age of television debates. Things have moved on since then. And I'm reminiscing, so I will stop that. So without further ado, let me hand over to Professor Peter Beresford to speak about community research, reconnecting the political with the personal. Peter.
Thanks ever so much for that, Jürgen. And could I first add my condolences to those that Jürgen has very appropriately offered. And I want to say a big hello to everyone. I want to thank everyone for taking part, being part of this discussion, and I hope giving it purpose. And I particularly want to thank, obviously, ARVAC and Jürgen for inviting me and giving me this chance for a few words. As I think Jürgen knows, I've had an involvement with ARVAC on and off for many years, even right from its beginning. All associated with ARVAC have worked hard over the years. I'm sure that over that time, all our efforts, their efforts to take forward community involvement, empowerment, and research have advanced with increasing understanding, commitment, and skill. But I still think, nonetheless, that over that long period, while we've made progress in understanding developments and gaining acceptance, the context has been a hard and I think increasingly stony one. The truth is that as the forces of challenge over the years through initiatives like ARVAC have developed in richness, breadth, diversity, the forces of resistance, in my view, have grown and multiplied in scale, harshness, maybe deviousness and cruelty. I hope you'll understand I have to read from a script. I can't do this without checking my notes, so I need to do that. Apologies. It's not a matter of the powers of resistance of the status quo. We're not talking about an historic status quo here. We're talking about a different ideological and political force, which now in the UK has an essentially uninterrupted history of almost half a century, and which continues with no clear indications of its end being in sight. And this is a phenomenon of international, indeed global reach. I'm talking obviously about neoliberalism, the modern worship of private profit and the market, and the agglomeration of wealth by a narrow range of individuals, families, and corporations, and its associated apparatus, globalized economics, so-called. Now, I'm not saying that this is all that's been happening, as you'll see, but I am saying, and I am suggesting, it's the global backdrop for all we struggle to do and achieve, to advance participation, empowering and liberatory research, empowerment more generally, and sustainability. And what I want to do today is be honest about that context and to articulate this issue. We all know that the long-term dominance of neoliberal ideology and the economics associated with it has restricted and often perverted the capacity to involve, empower, and include. Sometimes we have acted as though that was not the case, or we did not recognize that to be the case, as though it was situation normal, as may have been felt from the past. We've tried to act in isolation. We may have retreated to what the sociologist C. Wright Mills called abstracted empiricism. Well, I believe that this is both a tactical and a strategic error. I've been fortunate in my life to be involved in the struggles of many communities and groups for inclusion, involvement, and participation in research, in policy, practice, and their lives, including disabled people, mental health service users, of whom I identify as one, older people, and impoverished people, and as a member of a minority ethnic group. And this is a lesson I've learned consistently in these struggles. So today I want explicitly to try and address this issue, this context, particularly because it's the focus of my latest book. I'm not trying to sell it because it's not even got a publisher yet, which is concerned with making participatory change. I want briefly to touch on the arguments I've been developing there to set this discussion off in a setting where I hope it can be helpful and where there's long been an enthusiasm for hearing, debating, and developing inclusive and participatory ideas, approaches, change, and challenge. So let's remember my starting point, which seems like the almost unstoppable power of neoliberal ideology, politics, and policy here in the UK, but also globally. Let's remember also its well-evidenced consequences, well-evidenced even by those bodies that appear historically to have been supporters of it: the stifling of democracy, the encouragement of division and conflict, of increasing poverty, inequality, exclusion, disease, and rising mortality. Here we have seen, I'm saying, hatred engineered against disabled people, refugees and asylum seekers, trans people, and many, many more. We've seen the divisive and damaging effects of a dishonest and self-serving move to Brexit here. Globally, we have seen the reinforcement of global North exploitation of global South, the forced migration of multi-millions, and yet restrictions on their movement rising conflicts and tension between great powers, and the failure to address existential problems of sustainability facing us and the planet. Now, I want to outline briefly where it may be helpful to think about these multi-layered problems facing us, problems of threat from war and environmental damage, and problems of a politics that not only does little, if anything, about them and kind of boasts about it with its talk of the small state, but actually seems set on continuing to deny those problems and make them worse. And I want to draw on two watchwords to do this, two mantras that between them, I think, from trying to make sense of these issues, have exerted an important influence already, in one case for over 100 years, in another already having, I think, transformed understandings, many understandings in our modern age. The first is the expression only connect. The second is that the personal is political. And two phrases, 6 words. And I think the two watchwords are interrelated. And I think it's helpful, as I've tried to do, to make sense of them, to consider them together. Both are well known. I'm suggesting that both have a particular value for understanding and challenging our present individual and collective predicament, our national and global circumstances, crises and threats. So first, only connect. And that's been a mantra now for more than a century, first from the novelist E.M. Forster, through the poet T.S. Eliot, and the writer Richard Hoggart, known for his uses of literacy, all told us that it was crucial to connect for a progressive future. If we were to have a positive future together, all emphasized the importance of making connections between things and most of all with each other. All have been influential. All of those people were writing at times of great change and uncertainty, as now. Interestingly, all seem to face their own barriers in communicating on equal terms, through class, gender, language, and so on. You might think connecting, initially was a job done today, a period known as an age of communication. But if we look, as some people have done, more closely at politics and media, what we see are forces which seem bent on dividing us and getting between us, fostering misunderstanding, conflict, and even hatred. These institutions under prevailing ideology alienate us from each other and I think no less important, from ourselves. We are encouraged, for example, to vote as the person we would want or hope to be as aspirational citizens, rather than the constrained person we may actually be. We are encouraged to distance ourselves from those who would challenge such ideology and states as the blob, the chattering classes, the woke, and other terms of abuse. We live in a transformed world of internet, social networking, and a communication that was supposed to bring us all closer together and challenge the established media and powers above us, but which are now widely controlled by inordinately large and powerful corporations and states, where the routine talk and concerns are of trolling and engendering hatred, which are used to undermine democracy and spread false news, and regularly also are accused of alienating and damaging our children and young people. Now, we know that only connecting through such channels and media can have its serious constraints. We learn that who controls the technology may determine what purposes it serves and what dominant messages, in this case, it privileges and spreads. We can also learn that we at least can be actors with agency in this milieu, and that we may, at least to some extent, seek to manipulate the media, just as it seeks to manipulate us. But most of all, there is a lesson to be learned about what part intermediaries in communication and connection between us may play in undermining and subverting such connection and relationships. And we may begin to think about how much more we might find ways to communicate and connect with each other directly without the interference of such intermediaries? These are massive questions, I realize we need to be asking though more and more, especially when it comes to developing knowledge, both generally and in response to them. Inequality was pretty well built into the original calls from people like Forster, Eliot and Huggett to only connect, not least because of their own unequal and privileged status, circumstances, power and location. But if there's one lesson to be learned from the new social movements that have developed over the last half century, the same period as we've been seeing the emergence of neoliberalism, the women's, LGBTQ+, Black civil rights, and other new social movements, is that we must approach each other unmediated by others on the basis of equality, of treating diversity with equality, on the basis of our own understandings of ourselves and others, especially of ourselves, so that for this century, only connect is not likely to be enough. Our aspiration and goal must be to find ways only to connect equally and inclusively. So the lesson I have learned from our forefathers, and as I've made clear, it's been a matter of forefathers taking the ground, only connect, is that we must develop our own understandings, our own analyses, our own experiential knowledge as a basis for more direct, unmediated contact, connection, communication between us, which we work to develop in our languages, our commitment to access and inclusivity, to make communication with each other as equal and as accessible as possible, so that groups routinely left out, you realize we all do it without thinking, great swathes of people who also tend to be marginalized in formal politics, begin to be far more included and included on equal terms. I think COVID-19 has been a crucial reminder of the routine nature of such exclusions in communication and participation in life more generally, but also how these can be addressed and challenged by the same very communication means that would seek also to undermine and damage us. Obviously, this is a big and crucial agenda, a key reform I would argue we need to commit ourselves to as part of an everyday approach to change, working to take charge of our communication with each other, to restore kindness and equality and overcome division and dislocation, to communicate as much as we can directly with each other, or through our own channels, through networks, locally, without intermediaries, and in other ways that we can have charge of. Now let me turn to my second and related rallying cry, the personal is political, which of course we know as the key slogan from the second wave women's feminist movement from the late 1960s, also important as Wikipedia reminds us in the civil rights movement, student movement, and Black Power movement. It underscores the connections between personal experience and larger social and political structures. That's to say, it highlights the way in which actions and behaviors have been, are influenced, shaped, and circumscribed by structural and political pressures and discriminations. Thus, women's confinement to the private sphere, men's dominance in the public political sphere, and the inequalities institutionalized and perpetuated as a result of this. Now, you've got to forgive me here. I don't want this to come across as mansplaining or manspeaking or anything like that. I just have to turn to other groups to get the insights and inspirations that someone needs. That's my last intention. But as someone never comfortable with being a bloke, I want to report these insights, these valuable insights that have been learned from many and diverse sources, particularly in this case, I'm talking about women and their struggles signified by this slogan. That women's devaluing, the devaluing of what they do as people, wives, mothers, carers, workers, as gendered people, was politically structured, and it discriminated against them in at least two ways: how they and what they did was seen as inferior, and they were confined to roles that were treated as inferior and offering less power. And all this had political origins and was confirmed and maintained by our formal politics. And what the women's movement has done was challenge all and both, the restrictions and the exclusions that women face, and the devaluation of who they are and what they do. Now, I think Jürgen mentioned it. One of my fields of particular interest is social care, and social care is like an example of this written in huge letters. We can see it as a glaring instance of the highlighting of such issues and their collision of women being only expected to take on caring and support roles for adults as well as children, while also being expected to be in paid work nowadays, and the paid work they do and their careers being restricted. Of that work, however valuable, complex and important it is, if we're talking, say, of social care in supporting older and disabled people, being treated as low grade and menial and rewarded accordingly because it's associated with women. It's a vicious circle, and other devalued groups like Black and minoritized people and migrant labor given minimal priority, status and resourcing. What I regard as one of the most complex, important and difficult jobs that there could ever be, treated as though basically it's rubbish work. We can see how women, as part of their struggle, have sought to redefine themselves, redefine on an inclusive and equal basis their identity, roles and relationships, and how they have made global progress seeking to do this and advance their redefinitions of themselves, their lived experience and their experiential knowledge as a pioneering new social movement. And that brings me to my key point in relation to the women's movement statement, the personal is political, that we learn from it as women sought to encourage us to think of it not only as a demand and spur to make the political connections with the personal, but also the personal connections with the political, and to seek to transform that politics, our politics, what we understand as formal politics, to end its war against women and be based on the kind of inclusive, egalitarian and humanistic values that the women's movement have aspired to and been associated with, challenging violence, aggression, discrimination, exclusion, and valuing support, kindness, lived experience, and so on. We need to reset the roles and relations of politics, and we have, as we have those of the personal sphere, with values of equality, inclusion, anti-discrimination, and respect. Now, I need to make very clear, I'm not talking about this as though personal relationships are sorted, but over my lifetime, I have seen such unbelievable changes in how people now expect or even are required to behave to each other and understand each other that could never have been hoped for when I was just young. And I speak as somebody, obviously, who was heir to all those kinds of discriminations and prejudices themselves. If there's one thing we can say about most formal politics historically, but especially neoliberal politics and ideology, it is that they seek to weaken the personal connections with the political by making the formal political as atomistic, divisive, dehumanizing, alienating, antisocial as they can in the interests of individual profit, privilege, and advantage, so that such politics have to be for the benefit of the 1%, and how they encourage us not to want to be involved through disadvantaging, disempowering, and impoverishing the 99%. And we set up increasingly unequal, sickness-making, hostile, distrusting, maddening roles and relationships, damage and denude our planet, destroy any meaningful, positive work-life balance in pursuit of that profit gain, rather than seeking to adhere to the kinds of personal values we have not only been increasingly encouraged to live our lives by and bring up our children to believe in, but actually begun to do so based on inclusion, anti-discrimination, respect, equality, kindness, and sustainability for the future. And I think that this tension between regressive formal politics globally and the increasingly liberal ideals identified for us to each other as human beings by those ascendant new social movements of the last half century and more can be the engine for the change needed to bring about the end of the destructive ideology and politics imposed on us and provide the vision for a different process and destination. This understanding, the equal alliances it points to, engenders and demands, I believe may offer us here and internationally a route map, an impetus and a vision for making the political change that's needed. It's also consistent as a framework and supportive context for what we do in our community-based research and other participatory activities that can give them greater strength and purpose. And also, of course, that such research, as we're talking about particularly today, can play its own part most effectively alongside other liberatory forces to make possible empowering change that means that no longer is that 1% more powerful than a disparate 99%, but the alliances on the grounds of inclusion and the rest I've talked about within that 99% begin to come to a new fruition. Neoliberalism and its proponents may want us to forget or ignore the regressive connections they're based on of rising problems for the many. But if we seek to connect equally, we will surface these. As we listen to the women's movement, we will increasingly come to see how antagonistic such ideology is to such feminist, humanistic values through making the connections highlighted by the rallying call, the personal is political, and by the demand that the political is reframed in associated, more equal understandings of the personal. There lies, I think, a route to more humanistic, humanitarian politics, more sustainable policy, and hope for us all if we take that route. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. So very much appreciated. For starters, I will now stop the recording